Carla only has the best tech.
Can't connect to network.
But she didn't have the best internet. So she got Cox multi-gig speeds to power all her... Now, all her tech is...
Connected.
Exactly. Step it up with multi-gig speeds. Available everywhere. Only from Cox. 2 gig download speeds. Individual speeds vary. See Cox.com for details.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Hello, Beat Check listeners. I'm Gosia Woźniacka, and I'm the environmental justice reporter at The Oregonian. My guest is Sarah Esterson, a senior policy advisor on the state's energy facility siting team. This team is part of the Oregon Department of Energy, and its job is to review large energy projects, everything from transmission lines to big solar farms to wind farms. On our show today, we're going to talk about the exponential growth in recent years of large solar farms in rural Oregon. We'll address how that's impacting agriculture and rural landscapes in general, and what's being done to offset those impacts. So let's get started. Welcome to the show, Sarah. Thanks for taking the time to speak with me.
Thank you very much.
So I just wrote about Oregon's largest solar farm, Sunstone Solar in Morrow County, getting the stamp of approval from the state. This is a very, very large farm, 10,000 acres we're talking about, probably the largest solar farm in the U.S. thus far that has been proposed and approved. Now, this is not coming out of nowhere. Can you describe the growth of solar farms in the past couple decades in Oregon and how it has accelerated in the past few years?
In the last 2 decades, through the state siting process, the Energy Facility Council has approved 19 renewable energy facilities. But review of solar projects specifically has been fairly recent. Really starting in 2017, where the first solar project proposed was a 75 megawatt facility. And then since then, they've grown from as small as 50 megawatts on 300 acres up to what is now the largest in Oregon as Sunstone Solar Project at 1,200 megawatts on 9,442 acres. So we really have seen a significant expansion of the megawatt and footprint proposed in just the last 2 years. And just for another touch point, so in 2022, the largest approved solar facility in Oregon was the Obsidian Solar Center. That's approved in Lake County at 400 megawatts on 4,091 acres. Compared to then just 2 years later, the Sunstone Solar Project at 1,200 megawatts on 9,442 acres. Mm-hmm. So that's about a 200% increase in megawatt, 130% increase in footprint, again, in just 2 years.
Yeah, that's pretty significant. Mm-hmm. And just to be clear, the megawatts you mentioned, that's the generating capacity of these projects. So yes, both the acreage and the generating capacity of the projects has grown exponentially just within a few years in Oregon. Right. You mentioned 19 projects reviewed and approved by the Siting Council, but clearly there's been many, many more that were smaller projects reviewed and approved by counties. So absolutely. I just don't want our listeners to have the idea that we've only had 19 projects built in rural Oregon. We've had many, many more, except that many of them were much smaller.
Absolutely. Only the largest come through the state.
So these projects are going to be taking up a massive amount of land in rural Oregon. And many of them are still either in the approval process or just get approved. So it's going to be a few years before they're actually built. But no matter how you look at it, they're going to be taking up thousands of acres. And, you know, rural Oregon has beautiful views, has lots of farmland, rangeland, and areas that are important to farmers, but also to tourists and to wildlife. Can you talk about how the state is making sure that these areas are protected, that we don't just pave over all of rural Oregon with solar panels and windmills?
The Energy Facility Siting Council has adopted 15 standards or requirements, and several of them overlap or individually protect the resources that you've described. And the council does have the ability to initiate rulemaking if there were to be limitations in the existing standards, or even new resources that are within their jurisdiction to protect that need to be protected through a new standard. So that's always available. But so kind of just point by point in terms of the impacts. So impacts to beautiful views are or can be addressed through a couple of different standards. We have a recreational standard, a scenic resources standard, and a protected areas standard, and a historic, cultural, and archaeological resources standard, all of which necessitate and require a visual impact assessment. So this does mean that the resource, the view shed to the resource, has to be formally acknowledged either through the estate planning document or local planning document. And then that allows us and the developer to evaluate visual impacts. And just as some examples, so if we do come into that scenario, some of the mitigation that would be imposed are things like a setback to minimize impacts to viewshed. It could result in changes to siting in the particular location, or a certain type of finish to make sure that the infrastructure sort of is commensurate with other structures in the area. And then impacts to wildlife are protected under the Fish and Wildlife Habitat Standard, where that standard requires at a minimum a 1-to-1 acreage mitigation threshold offset. So any habitat that's impacted is fully mitigated plus. Impacts to farmland and rangeland is protected under the council's land use standard, where the council evaluates state and local land use requirements, which always includes an evaluation of impacts to accepted agricultural practices and the costs thereof. And that it includes an evaluation of a Goal 3 exception request, it includes an obligation to demonstrate consistency with the surrounding land use. And then I think you mentioned impacts to tourists. So that isn't a direct impact assessment that would occur through the state siting process, but it is captured indirectly through the evaluation of the recreation standard. So a recreational opportunity that's important would be evaluated in a manner where you're looking at the users, the type of use, the significance of the use, and then you evaluate the impacts to that use and user, where at a minimum, a developer or an applicant is required to evaluate impacts of construction and operational noise, visual, traffic, and physical impacts. So again, that's a level where tourism can come into the evaluation.
Got it. Okay, so it sounds like you've got all these standards and some requirements for wildlife for mitigating the habitat or offsetting habitat that was lost. Mm-hmm. But we still have many, projects with thousands of acres going in rural areas, and so it sounds like there are exceptions to these rules that developers get, because it's not that you have a standard, and if say said solar farm is destroying the views, it's not going to be approved, or if it's taking up rural farmland that's cultivable, it's not going to be approved. It often is approved. So how does that work?
Well, absolutely. I mean, we view the land use standard as obligating significant protection of agricultural lands. And so any project, any solar project that would use or occupy more than 12 acres of high value farmland or more than 20 acres of arable land is required to seek an exception to the statewide policy embodied in Goal 3. Again, Goal 3 is the preservation of agricultural lands in Oregon. So an applicant has to demonstrate that there's adequate reasons to take this amount of land for use as an energy facility. And the vast majority of the solar projects that are coming through the state permitting process are proposed on agricultural lands or land zoned exclusive farm use. And we track projects kind of holistically as well as individually. And we work very closely with Department of Land Conservation and Development staff to better understand the statewide impacts. And what we have seen today is that the number of farms in Oregon has declined by 6% between 2017 and 2022. And the acreage of lands in farms in Oregon has declined by 4%. And a lot of the projects that that have been approved so far have been in Morrow County, which has also seen a decline. And that just has resulted in a much higher focus, a much higher substantive threshold, and need for the goal exception process to really be evaluating the impacts of taking this land out of agricultural production. And so we've done a lot of work to inform applicants on the expectations and recommendations for how to do this evaluation, because it's somewhat unclear what an expectation would be of how to evaluate the significance of the direct and indirect impacts from siting of a solar project.
I want to kind of repeat what you said, which is that the vast majority of solar projects today are being permitted on land that's protected for agricultural use. There are a couple exceptions, a few projects that have been approved on industrial land inside urban growth boundaries. But again, vast majority of projects are going on protected ag land and specifically on high value farmland or cultivable land. Mm-hmm. And so what you're saying is that there are these standards and yet developers can apply for exceptions, and pretty much most of these projects, these large projects the state approves, do apply for these exceptions, and all of these projects that have been recently approved have received the exceptions. So can you talk a little bit about the process that a developer has to go through to get an exception, and sort of what do they have to do to prove that they are allowed to take out valuable farmland from our state?
Well, and so the process of seeking approval of a goal exception is embedded in the 7-step siting process, which takes several years. But then the goal exception is, one piece of the land use standard. The land use standard is one of 15 standards that are evaluated. So again, it's the processes within a much larger process. And the state's land use standard establishes its own specific goal exception criteria, which is called a reasons exception request, where it is up to an applicant to propose reasons that they believe that the conversion of the use is justified. That's one piece of a 3-piece goal exception. The other 2 pieces are an economic, social, energy, and environment consequences analysis, and then a compatibility with adjacent land uses analysis.
What are the reasons that the state or the siting council typically deems to be reasonable, important, that would lead it to grant an exception to a developer seeking to develop on prime farmland?
The reasons that council has approved to date, and you have to have more than one reason, but is minimal or no direct impacts to agriculture. This could apply to a site that has been able to demonstrate that for 30 to 50 years, if ever, have never been cultivated or used for a farming practice. And then we have a suite of recommendations that we also recommend developers use to evaluate the question of whether use of the site would have a minimal direct impact to agriculture. Another reason that they've supported is locational dependency, and this is often related to the proximity of an existing transmission line or interconnection point that would allow the energy facility to interconnect without a significantly long transmission line, as well as nearly direct access to key transportation routes. So the council likes when we don't have to have significant road building or transmission line building as part of the site selection. And another key reason that they've accepted is local economic benefits when those benefits are proven to be related to the agriculture economy of the jurisdiction that the site is within.
So you mentioned one of the reasons being minimal impacts on the agricultural economy. And yet, for example, Sunstone Solar, this extremely large solar farm that was just approved, I mean, that was approved on land that is arable land in dryland wheat that's been actively farmed and cultivated in recent years. So it's not land that's been laying fallow, for years or anything like that. So I want to talk a little bit more about this impact because, clearly families that are leasing their land for the solar projects are going to get compensated. So they're not going to be hurt directly. But then, each farm also supports non-farm families that provide other services to farmers. So we have fuel, fertilizer, chemical treatments, warehousing, transportation services. These are all other people in the agricultural community that do these jobs that service this farm. And so once you take the farm out of production, you are basically impacting all these other jobs in the community. And solar, as we know, doesn't provide a lot of jobs except during construction process. And so I'm wondering what standards, if any, exist in the state that would basically guide developers on how to offset these losses to the agricultural economy as a whole. Because what I've been hearing talking with farmers is that it's the whole community that will suffer when a solar farm, a large solar farm, comes in and takes out a significant chunk of land. So are there any guidelines in the state that say, developer, yes, we will give you an exception to the rule. You can develop the solar farm, but as a result, you have to do X, Y, and Z to offset the losses in this small farming community. Is there anything like that in Oregon currently?
Sort of. I mean, so I guess just to back up a little bit, there is a requirement, it's a conditional use requirement that applies for all solar projects, local or state, that requires a demonstration that use of the proposed site won't result in significant impacts to accepted farm practices or the cost thereof on surrounding lands. Now, that's all the requirement says. And so it has been difficult through the state process for applicants to really understand the scope and scale of how that assessment is done. And then, so we have over time and seen what projects are doing and, running the public process and working with our partners at the Department of Agriculture and at Department of Land Conservation and Development to understand how that evaluation can be set up. And in terms of really evaluating the indirect impacts from, again, taking that land out of accessibility for use as a agricultural practice. And as of 2018, the Department of Energy developed a guidance memo, and we're actually refining that as a result of the last two solar projects, that being Sunstone Solar Project and the Wagon Trail Solar Project, which were the two largest projects. They just keep getting bigger. And as we said already, the significance of the goal exception, the significance of the evaluation of impacts, both direct and indirect, is increasing. And we want for applicants to know what we expect. And maybe there would be rulemaking in the next few years through the state. It is ever evolving, and people are really working on it. Right now, our format is in policy guidance that we rolled out with the council on December 13th, and we plan to continue rolling out over the next couple of months. But our current guidance, what we are saying in providing to applicants, is that they, kind of follow the Sunstone model to evaluate indirect impacts, which included use of this economic impact software called IMPLAN. And that software was used by a public policy firm called Eco Northwest, and they evaluate kind of all the inputs associated with that relies on that land.
So it sounds like there's no specific guidelines on what developers should do, but you mentioned Sunstone Solar and their recent proposal as sort of being a model that the state is now looking at. And so Sunstone Solar kind of went out of the way and proposed a mitigation fund, basically a fund where they would pay a fee per acre to Morrow County. And Morrow County would basically administer this fund and pay it out to the agricultural community, to those who were the most impacted by the developer, Pine Gate Renewables, who is the developer of Sunstone, taking out this large 10,000-acre chunk of land from production. And so this fund is pretty rare. It's I've only found the state of New York has kind of a similar guidelines where they ask developers to pay a fee per acre to offset the damage to the ag economy. But it's pretty rare. And so it sounds like this is sort of a new direction that Oregon is going with these large farms.
Yeah, I mean, so this would be the third project that has proposed an actual dollar amount to offset the indirect impacts from siting of the project. Oregon Trail Solar did it, Wagon Trail Solar did it, and Sunstone Solar Project did it. What Sunstone did that was a little different was to really, utilize this IMPLAN software to evaluate actual indirect and then offset, including a net benefit, to an up to $11 million benefit. And so that, it's really transparent and understandable as to what the impacts would be, and just, again, to give some examples, they had the inputs and types of services, impacts on suppliers and service providers, impacts on people that were indirectly employed in ancillary businesses. So they quantified all that using this software to come up with the number. And that approach certainly was different for Sunstone. And it is one that is understandable by the council, and so really supported. And we hope that people will follow that model.
One question I'm hoping you can address, which I often get from readers, is why aren't these large solar farms taking advantage of the agrivoltaics model, which is basically the growing of crops under solar panels, or the grazing of animals under solar panels. It's happening in a few places in the US, in Europe. What are the challenges of doing this sort of marriage of agriculture and solar panels in Oregon?
Sure. So to date, we've had 4 state jurisdictional projects constructed. 3 of them were Avangrid backed, 1 Nextera. And so 3 of those 4, since approval, have requested to utilize sheep grazing for vegetation management, and the council has approved that, but that it's still pretty new. I mean, this sheep grazing proposal came through within the last year, so we haven't yet seen whether it's been utilized or the success of it. So we don't know if it's a viable long-term option. But more specifically to your question of agrovoltaics, I mean, that creates a complexity and limitation with the evaluation of direct impacts to agriculture on the site. If the site is viable to support those types of crops, it would be much more difficult for them to even get approval. So most of the sites where solar have been proposed so far have demonstrated a challenge with accessing any type of water, and shown that they've even had a lack of success in farming as a dry land crop, and so that's one point. And then from a kind of more complex regulatory perspective, it's both the land use standard and the council's wildfire prevention and risk mitigation standard that would also create complexities. So again, through the land use standard under the Goal 3 exception, this would disincentivize proposals where agrovoltaics would be successful, because we're looking for sites really that haven't been highly successful in an ag practice. And then the wildfire standard requires fairly significant vegetation management to make sure that risk of wildfire to or from the site is minimized to the maximum extent feasible.
So that would prevent the grazing. Like if you want to graze, you obviously don't want to mow down your
exactly right.
And so the sheep wouldn't be seen as a wildfire mitigation measure, or the goats or whatever.
No. I mean, so far, sheep grazing we've gotten full support from both the council and Department of Ag and ODF, the Department of Fish and Wildlife, as we've coordinated with them on whether this could work for an energy facility.
Okay, so they don't see it as an impediment.
Not sheep grazing, but agrovoltaics, otherwise crops, could be problematic.
Got it. Makes sense. And obviously it costs potentially more money if the developer wants to, build solar panels that are taller so that crops can be grown underneath, or maybe more spaced out so that the animals can, walk around them. So it seems like it's a little more challenging than the typical. Two other sort of general questions about these that I also get from readers is, how much are these very large farms going to help us as a state reach our clean energy goals? We are supposed to reach 100% carbon-free clean electricity by 2040. So that's about 15 years. Do we need a bunch more of these 10,000-acre farms to make that happen?
Well, so from our perspective, state jurisdictional solar facilities are one part of a many-part solution to the state's renewable energy goals. So there are many other challenges for developers that aren't part of the state siting process, such as obtaining interconnection and power purchase agreements so that they can transmit and sell the power, and demonstrating that they can interconnect or that they have a power purchase agreement isn't a requirement through our process. And so this results in, large projects that are permitted, but then not constructed either within their forecasted time frame or not at all, or at a much smaller scale than what's permitted. And we don't have any, we can ask questions, but we aren't, we don't have rules that would prompt us to be asking those questions on an ongoing basis. But for an example, The Wheat Ridge Renewable Energy Facility 3, which is a solar facility backed by NextEra in Morrow County, it was approved as a 150 megawatt facility, but only 50 megawatts was built. Maybe that, that was a couple of years ago. And so we've only had 4 solar projects built to date. And the other 3 were actually built to their full permitted capacity. So maybe it will start to change, but we haven't seen anything at the scale of Sunstone or Wagon Trail or Obsidian, those great big ones, actually move forward. So we have no idea if they will be full build out or a third. And there's no requirement that they, build what they're permitted.
So they could build smaller, actually, and really it's all kind of dependent on whether we build more transmission lines so then they can hook into the system and actually send the energy on to the cities and
exactly
population centers that need it.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other question I often get from readers is, how much is this going to cost me? People in cities, especially, who are far away from these projects, they see these large wind and solar farms going in, and it seems expensive to build them, and rates for electricity have increased significantly. PGE has increased their rates in the past few years by more than 40%. And so a lot of readers write to me really concerned about, is this going to increase my rates, basically? And I know you can't necessarily speak to that, but I'm wondering, what do you see in terms of the cost to develop solar as you see more of these large facilities proposed?
Yeah, and the state siting process really doesn't track development costs or costs to the ratepayer as part of our review process. But there are other divisions within the department that do track a level of information, and so I can share that. So we have an interactive dashboard that shows how solar's changed in Oregon over the last 25 years. And so what we know is that since 1999, it costs about $16.50 per watt to install solar on a rooftop. And then as of 2021, that cost has dropped down to $3.66 per watt. So we would expect for larger solar projects to have a cost per watt that's likely even lower than that.
Because of economies of scale.
Exactly. Yeah, and I guess the other point we have is that Oregon utilities are thoughtful about their investments in acquiring clean energy. And so Oregonians can follow the Oregon Public Utility Commission's planning process so that they can understand potential impacts as a ratepayer.
Absolutely. And we encourage all our listeners to do that. And I will put links to both the dashboard and to the Utility Commission website in the podcast notes. Sarah, thank you. This has been a really important conversation and fascinating. We'll be following this topic in future stories in the Oregonian and online at OregonLive.com. Thank you so much for listening to Beat Check with the Oregonian. If you like this show, please give us a 5-star rating and review an Apple Podcast. It helps people find the show. The best way to support our journalism and stories like this is with a subscription to Oregon Live. You can do that at OregonLive.com/podsupport. Until next time, thank you.